Today I would like to show you how you can build really scalable systems within N8N using a framework that I invented called the atomic automation method. And this system will basically allow you to build automations that are modular, maintainable, and trustworthy. And this will free you basically from everything in regards to spaghetti code. And we are going to look at this using an example of a system that I have built, which is a lead generation system which looks like this, and I'm going to explain everything with those examples. Now, if you're familiar with certain kinds of posts on LinkedIn and Reddit and wherever where people are kind of proud of the monolith workflows that they are building, then this has become kind of the norm, right? So spaghetti workflows are the norm basically. So one giant workflow doing everything and until it doesn't, right? So when it breaks, nobody knows why, and this is definitely not maintainable. Now, the solution to this are actually using or building rather small, focused, and composable workflows. So each flow does exactly one thing, which you can remove, replace, or debug, and then without having to touch anything else, right? And these are very specific or very professional, actually, approaches how you can build these kinds of infrastructures. Now, there are certain rules that you can and should adhere to when building these kinds of flows, and there are 7 within this atomic automation framework. And the first one is that there is the same responsibility per trigger, right? So everyone does the same thing. So there's no conditional branching that changes what the flow fundamentally does, right? So there's one trigger, one behavior always. So if we take a look into the structure that I have prepared here, then you can see, for instance, that also judging by the naming convention, we are going to get into that later, that there's a specific job each and every one of those workflows does, right? So for instance, we're still talking about lead generation and with the email outreach system that I've built right here. And for instance, one fundamental part of this would be to get leads, right? To scrape leads. And if we jump into this very flow right here, then you can see that this is what it looks like. So an extremely simple flow, right? Yes, I know there's no error handling, no guardrails, whatever, but for this specific purpose, that's totally fine. And it's extremely easy to not only maintain, but also to follow along what exactly it does. And then also in regards to the first rule that we are talking about now, we have a manual trigger right here, right? But you can basically replace this, but it won't change what this specific flow does exactly, right? So everyone does the same thing. Now, second rule is to have one flow, one job, and you can basically describe it in one sentence, right? So if you can't describe it, what it does in a single sentence, then it's probably doing too much, right? And you might be familiar with these different kinds of flows which kind of grow organically, right? And then you basically end up with a really complex structure that doesn't help anybody, not even yourself if you look at it back 3 months later, right? Now, the third rule is to have one output and one place. So a flow writes its result to exactly one destination. So not 2 or 3, but only one. And the downstream flows read that one place. Meaning, for instance, that if I am using this specific flow as an example, which basically just scrapes leads using API, right? And then I'm just comparing it with the existing lead list that I have, and I'm using Google Sheets here as a reference, as a database replacement if you want, but this is actually my single source of truth with which each of those flows can refer to, right? So there is no ambiguity, no two databases, not a text file or a JSON somewhere hidden in a different system. All of these flows refer back to this specific sheet, right? So the results are going to be placed into that one sheet, meaning that if, for instance, I look into another flow which also belongs to that whole infrastructure, where in this case I'm going to create a personalized salutation, right? Or even, and I'm going to jump in another flow, create a personalization itself, right? So based on this specific lead and his biography, probably I would create an interesting introductory sentence for that specific email, right? Now each and every one of those flows refer back to that specific Google Sheet, right? So if I ran this on a scheduled trigger, or if I would even use a webhook, or if I would execute this via a parent flow, then all of this wouldn't be a problem because they don't depend on each other, but they are also always taking this specific Google Sheet as a reference, right? All right, now the next rule is that you are going to build flows that are end-to-end complete, right? So you run it alone and it definitely works, meaning that there are no dependencies between those flows with each other, right? So every atomic flow is self-contained, so it doesn't depend on another flow having run first in the same session, right? Now, obviously, you can stitch them together and you can create data flows between these different kinds of flows, but at the end of the day, it definitely makes sense to have them self-contained, right? Meaning, for instance, in our lead generation system that we have right here, that, for instance, if I, for some reason, just want to scrape the leads that I want to send those emails to, but I don't need a salutation or I don't need a personalization, then that's also perfectly fine because the next flow, the subsequent flow, does not depend on the next one, right? So this is definitely also something helpful. And then the next thing is that it is not even advisable to not depend the flows on each other, but also to make them omittable, right? So if you remove it, then nothing else breaks. This is related to the fourth rule, but it even goes further than this, because you can disable any atomic flow without cascading failures. The system degrades gracefully, not catastrophically, right? So if, as I've mentioned already, for some reason you didn't want to use these specific functions or these specific flows that do a certain job at all, not even replace them with another flow, but you don't want to use them at all, then that's perfectly fine, right? You can still use the whole system using the modules, if you will, right? And pick and choose the ones that are necessary for your specific use case. And then the next thing is that they are, and this is also connected to the fifth rule, the rule number 6, which is that they are replaceable. So you can swap them out and nothing else changes, meaning you can replace any flow with a different implementation. Adjacent flows don't care, right? They only know the contract, and we are going to get into the contract in a second. So, which also means that if for some reason there is a different flow that you would like to use instead of this one, then this can definitely be implemented into the existing infrastructure. And then we have the last rule, rule number 7, which is to have an explicit input-output contract, right? So you know what goes in and what goes out, or what is explicitly necessary to come out and to go in, and this is documented, right? So every flow declares its expected inputs and defined outputs, no implicit knowledge, no surprises 3 months later, right? Now, what this could mean within n8n, for instance, in this case, is that we are going to, if we are going to use something like webhooks or something like subsequent workflows, right? So sub workflows, then this could definitely be helpful if you only allow a certain structure, right? Which has to come in here so that the parent flow calling that subflow is going to know what exactly it's supposed to provide to the subsequent flow, right? All right, now this is the 7th rule. Now the next thing is to also use a naming convention, which basically helps you to keep that overview, right? Especially if you're building complex systems and each and every one of those is separated into the subsequent flows, then it's necessary and obligatory and helpful for yourself to have a nice naming convention. Now this is a logic that you can use, for instance, which is to have the domain which this specific flow covers, right? And then just to add the verb and the object, what exactly this one flow does. And remember, right, we had this in the rule overview that it is necessary to have one job that this specific flow does, right? So in this case, for instance, we could have leads and then it's dot. And by the way, they are separated by a period, right? And these are all lowercase. So you have leads and then qualify inbound, or you have clients and then send report. And then there might be special cases where you would just want to use configuration flows for somehow, right? For some reason. And then you can basically prefix them with an underscore so that they look like this. And there are no sequence numbers, right? So the order belongs in a system map, not the name, right? So this is exactly what we talked about earlier, that if you have a system like this where you can just replace each and every one of those flows, then having a chronological order in that regard wouldn't make sense, right? Because we want to have that flexibility and the replaceability and so on and so forth. All right, now there are 6 ways how you can undo all of this, which basically means that there are patterns that can turn those clean automations into liabilities, so you need to know them and avoid them. So these are the anti-patterns. Now, the first one is the monolith, right? We already talked about this. So you have one flow doing everything. So it does the intake, it does the qualifying, the storing, email, notifying, everything else is in that same flow. So it feels efficient to build this, but it's impossible to maintain or reuse, right? So you have a bad pattern where this one flow basically does everything. So you have the form, then the enrichment, qualification, whatnot. And a better case for this, right, or the fix for this is actually to split this into these separate flows, right? So this would be exactly the system that you can see here. And this would basically violate rule 2. Now, the next anti-pattern is the scatter output, right? So a flow that writes its results to a database and fires a webhook and updates a CRM all at the same time. And these three systems now depend on its internals, right? So within for the bad pattern, this would mean you have the qualification, write this to a table, fire the webhook, update the CRM record. Now, the fix is to have one output only, right? So other reactions live in a separate flow, which is going to be triggered by that single output, right? And not doing this would violate rule 3. Then we have anti-pattern 3, the Siamese twin. So this one violates rule 5 and 6. So you have two flows that look separate but are hard-coded to each other via a webhook URL or shared column names, and then remove one and the other silently fails, right? So the pattern would be flow A hard-codes flow B's webhook URL, flow B reads flow A's exact column name. Now, a better fix for this would be to have the flows communicate only through a shared documented in an output contract, and to never be the direct reference. And this is exactly what we talked about in this flow with our Google Sheet, right? And also with the in and output contract. Then building upon that, we have the anti-pattern 4, which is the implicit contract, right, which violates rule 7. So a flow expects a specific JSON shape as input, but documents nothing. So it works because you build both ends. It breaks when anyone touches either side. So the bad pattern would be flow B just knows what fields flow A will pass, no schema, no docs whatsoever. The fix, every flow explicitly declares the expected input fields and types and the structure of its output, right? So if, for instance, imagine that I'm going to use any of these flows, right, and I'm going to take, let's say, the salutation, and I want to connect this somehow, then, for instance, if I was to use the execute subflow trigger, right, and you can use it like this, then there are certain fields that you can explicitly define which you are expecting, right, from the calling flow in this regard. And this is just one method how you could do this. The next thing, anti-pattern 5, is the shapeshifter, violates rule 1. A flow behaves differently depending on a condition baked into its core logic. So one trigger, two completely different outcomes. This is what we talked about at the very beginning. So that's two responsibilities disguised as one. So the bad pattern would be, if it's a cold lead, run the enrichment. If it's a warm lead, skip to the email, right? It's the same trigger, but definitely different outcome. The fix is to split this into two flows, one for cold leads, one for warm leads, and each does one thing. And then, last but not least, the orphan dependency, which violates rule 4, which is a flow that only worked if a specific other flow ran first in the same execution context, right? So it runs in isolation and it errors or produces nothing. So, but the bad pattern would be flow B reads a session variable set by flow A moments earlier. So the fix is flow B fetches what it needs independently at runtime. No shared state, no assumed execution order. So you see, the final goal would be to build it once and trust it forever. All right, so this was a kind of a theoretical session today, a little different than usual, but from my experience, and I've built hundreds of projects, that it is actually a real life problem that people are building like these monolith structures and don't even know what to start with and how you can basically prevent this from breaking, right? And this framework is built on the experience that I have, a very good pattern and method that you can follow to build reliable and scalable workflows within n8n. All right, this is already it for today. Thanks a lot for your attention. Hope to see you next time, and see ya. Bye.